British titles seem simple from a distance. A king, a prince, a duke, a baron. But the moment you look closer, the whole system turns into a maze. Because in Britain, royalty and nobility are not exactly the same thing. A prince is not just a nobleman with a fancier name. A knight is honored, but not actually part of the peerage. And a lord may be a real rank, a courtesy title, or simply a form of address. So if you have ever wondered who actually outranks who, this is the simple version. We are going to untangle the British system step by step, from knight to baron, from earl to duke, and then up into royalty itself. And the most important thing to understand from the very beginning is this. Britain does not have one single ladder of titles. It has several overlapping systems layered on top of each other over centuries. That is why it feels confusing. First, there is the monarchy itself, the king or queen and the royal family. Second, there is the peerage, the 5 main noble ranks: baron, viscount, earl, marquess, and duke. And third, there are honors and hereditary distinctions outside the peerage, like knight and baronet. So before we rank anything, we need to separate those categories clearly. Otherwise, none of the titles will make proper sense. Let's start with the easiest distinction of all. Royalty is not the same as nobility. A king or queen stands above the peerage entirely. Princes and princesses belong to the royal family, not to the peerage just because they are princes and princesses. But some royals can also hold peerage titles, which is where the confusion begins. A prince may also be a duke. A royal duke may outrank ordinary nobles socially, while still holding a title that also exists in the peerage. That is why British titles are not just about who sounds grander. They are about category, blood, inheritance, and history. If this already sounds messy, don't worry. Once you split the system into pieces, it becomes much easier to understand. First, we will look at the peerage itself, the actual ladder of noble ranks. The first title people usually think of is knight. A knight is not part of the peerage. That is important. A knighthood is an honor, not a noble rank in the same sense as baron, earl, or duke. Traditionally, knights were mounted warriors who served a lord or king in battle. In medieval England, knighthood was tied to warfare, loyalty, and military service. A knight was expected to fight, to lead, and to uphold a code of honor, at least in theory. But over time, the title changed. Today, a knighthood is mostly an honor awarded for service, achievement, or public contribution. It may be given for work in politics, charity, science, music, literature, business, or public life. A man who receives a knighthood is called Sir. A woman is called Dame. But the title is not hereditary. It does not automatically pass to children. It ends with the person who received it. So in simple terms, a knight is respected, recognized, and honored, but a knight is not a peer. And just above knight, at least in the part of the system that confuses people most, is a title that often gets left out: baronet. A baronet is also not part of the peerage, but unlike a knighthood, it is hereditary. That means it can pass down through the family, usually from father to son. This is why people sometimes call a baronet a kind of hereditary knighthood. That is not a perfect definition, but it helps explain why the title feels halfway between knight and noble. A baronet is addressed as Sir, just like a knight. But a baronet is not a baron. The names sound similar, but they are not the same rank and not the same category. That distinction matters a lot. A baron is part of the peerage. A baronet is not. So before we even enter the true noble ladder, the order is already starting to make more sense. First comes knight, which is an honor. Then baronet, which is hereditary, but still outside the peerage. And only after that do we step into the actual peerage itself, beginning with the lowest noble rank, baron. A baron is the lowest rank in the British peerage, but lowest can sound smaller than it really was. Historically, a baron was still a major figure, a landholder, a political player, and a man with direct ties to the crown. In medieval England, barons held land from the king in exchange for loyalty and service, especially military support. They were part of the upper structure of the realm, not minor gentlemen at the edge of it. Over time, the role changed. Like many old titles, it became less about personally leading armed men and more about status, inheritance, and political influence. Barons became part of the aristocratic order that shaped the kingdom from within. And in later centuries, the title remained important because barons were part of the peerage and connected to the House of Lords. So this is the first true step into nobility in the peerage sense. Not knight, not baronet. Baron. Above baron comes Viscount. This is one of the titles people often recognize the least, even though it sits right in the middle of the peerage ladder. The word comes from the Latin idea of a deputy count, and historically it referred to someone acting under a count or earl. In Britain, the title eventually became its own peerage rank, sitting above baron and below earl. A viscount may not sound as famous as duke or earl, but it is still a real peerage title, and it outranks a baron. In modern popular culture, people often skip over viscounts entirely, which is one reason British titles can seem more confusing than they are. But the order matters. A viscount stands one step above a baron. Then comes earl. This is one of the oldest titles in England, and one of the most distinctly British. Most of Europe used the title count, but England kept the older Germanic word earl. That is why the male title is earl, but the female equivalent is still countess. Historically, earls were extremely important. They were among the leading nobles of the kingdom, often tied to major territories, military command, and political influence. In earlier periods, an earldom could mean enormous regional authority. Over time, like the other titles, that practical power faded, but the rank remained highly prestigious. So by this point, the ladder looks like this: Baron Viscount Earl, and that already clears up one of the most common points of confusion. In Britain, Earl is the equivalent of what many other countries would call a count. Above an Earl comes marquess. And this is where many people pause because the title is less common, and the pronunciation often trips people up too. A marquess ranks above an earl and below a duke. Historically, this title was connected to the marches, meaning border regions. These were sensitive areas at the edges of a kingdom, where defense mattered most. Because borderlands were unstable and strategically important, the men placed over them could hold great authority. That is why a marquess came to rank above an earl. Over time, like so many titles in Britain, the role became less about personally defending a frontier and more about inherited status. But the rank remained very high. A marquess is still one of the top levels of the peerage, even if the title is much less common in everyday conversation. That is also one reason people often misplace it. In novels and television, duke and earl are easy to remember, but marquess tends to get lost in between. Still, the order is clear: Baron, Viscount, Earl, Marquess. And above all of them, at the top of the peerage, stands the duke. A duke is the highest rank in the British peerage. The word ultimately comes from the Latin dux, meaning leader. In Britain, dukes came to represent the highest level of non-royal nobility, though of course some dukedoms are also held by members of the royal family. That is where another common confusion begins. A duke can be a noble duke or a royal duke. The title is the same, but the person holding it may belong either to the peerage alone or to the royal family as well. Historically, dukes could control enormous lands, wealth, and influence. For centuries, only a very small number of people held ducal titles, and the rank carried immense prestige. Even today, duke remains the grandest title within the peerage. So if we are speaking strictly about the 5 ranks of the peerage, the order is now complete. Baron, Viscount, Earl, Marquess, Duke. That is the noble ladder. But now we reach the point where many people get confused again, because royalty is not the same thing as the peerage. A prince or princess is not simply the next step above duke in the same ladder. It is a royal title, not a peerage rank. That distinction matters. A prince belongs to the royal family because of birth or specific royal rules, not because he sits one rung above the nobility in the peerage system. In Britain, the title of prince or princess is governed by royal rules and tradition, not by the same structure that creates dukes, earls, or barons. This is why someone can be both a prince and a duke at the same time. For example, a royal prince may also hold a dukedom. But those are 2 different kinds of title layered onto the same person. Then there is the special case of the Prince of Wales. The Prince of Wales is not just any prince. It is a specific title traditionally granted to the heir apparent, usually the eldest son of the monarch. That makes it one of the most famous royal titles in Britain, but it is still different from the peerage ranks we just listed. And above all of this stands the king or queen. The monarch does not belong at the top of the peerage ladder, because the monarch stands above it entirely. A king or queen is not simply the highest noble. The monarch is the crown itself. Historically, British kings and queens once held far more direct political power than they do now. Over many centuries, that power was limited by law, parliament, and constitutional change. Today, Britain is a constitutional monarchy, which means the monarch remains head of state, but does not rule in the older absolute sense. So the full picture becomes much easier once you separate the systems. First, outside the peerage, you have knight/dame baronet. Then inside the peerage, you have Baron, Viscount, Earl, Marquess, Duke. And above the peerage, in the royal sphere, you have Prince, Princess, Prince of Wales, King, Queen. And one last thing, because this word causes endless confusion. Lord. Lord is not one single rank. It is often a form of address used for several different people in the system, especially peers and certain courtesy titles. So when you hear Lord, it does not automatically tell you whether the person is a baron, an earl's son, or something else entirely. That is why British titles feel confusing at first. But once you split them into honors, peerage, and royalty, the system becomes much easier to read. Here is the simplest way to remember it. If someone is a knight, that is an honor. If someone is a baronet, that is hereditary, but still outside the peerage. If someone is a baron, viscount, earl, marquess, or duke, that person is part of the peerage. And if someone is a prince, princess, king, or queen, that person belongs to the royal family, which is a different category again. So the biggest mistake people make is trying to force everything into one straight line. It is not one straight line. It is several old systems layered on top of each other. That is why a duke may be the highest noble, but still not be royal. That is why a prince may also be a duke. That is why a baronet sounds noble, but is not part of the peerage. And that is why lord can mean several different things depending on the person. Once you understand that, British titles stop sounding random. They start sounding historical, because that is really what they are. A stack of traditions, privileges, offices, and inherited ranks built over centuries and never fully simplified. So if you ever need the short version again, it is this: Knight/Dame Baronet Baron Viscount Earl Marquess, Duke Prince/Princess King/Queen. And of course, like everything in Britain, the moment you think the system is finally simple, a few exceptions appear. Royal dukes are not quite the same as ordinary dukes. Lord can mean several different things, and titles like Prince of Wales belong to their own special tradition. But as a basic map, this is the structure that helps everything else make sense. And now, at least, the next time you find yourself at a very crowded British tea party with a knight, a baronet, a baron, a viscount, an earl, a marquess, a duke, and a prince, you will know exactly who outranks whom, and who probably expects the best chair in the room. Thank you for watching. If you value history told carefully and accurately, consider staying with this channel and subscribing. The past deserves precision as much as curiosity.